Welcome to the Business is Good podcast with Chris Young, president of the Good Place Institute, helping leaders build and steward thriving organizations where people flourish, communities prosper, and the organization is economically regenerative. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg. It's said that if you don't manage your finances, they'll manage you. What does that mean? Money is neither good nor evil, but left out of order without proper controls, money, either in excess or lack, can be a nightmare without a plan to manage it. If you're a business owner, you know what I mean, but I digress. The Good Place Institute is all about helping us create good places to work, and we can't do that without financial management. Chris, let's talk money. What makes financial management different in a Good Place organization?
Yeah, great question, Jim. Always good to be with you and talk about Good Place financial management, or better yet, Good Place financial stewardship. So that's the first place we need to start is who's the owner? We talked about that in a previous episode, but we really want to talk about stewardship of our finances. So it's probably better yet talked about stewardship. And one of the places we want to start with is money is always a means. It's never an ends, even though we measure it from a business perspective like it is an ends.
And that's interesting you say it's a means to an end, but it's not the end all be all, because we've all met people who have all kinds of money and they're miserable. So, and we've also seen super successful companies that have all kinds of excess cash, yet are they really accomplishing what they want to accomplish? I don't know. So, Chris, how does a Good Place Institute help leaders think biblically about profit, about reinvestment, and about generosity? Let's start with profit. How do you help leaders think biblically about profit?
Yeah, well, one thing we like to do is we want to think biblically. So the answer is a little bit in your question there, because money is the second most talked about thing in the Bible, over 2,000 times, at least the idea of money and finances. And there's nothing wrong with money and finances. There's nothing wrong with profit. What do we do with that profit? That surplus that the organization produces, that profitability, we call it economic regeneration. And we want to regenerate those surplus finances, those surplus resources back into the organization so that it can do exactly what you just shared, is accomplish the real aims of the organization, which, if you're a good place, we're going to talk about people flourishing and communities prospering, your customers, your suppliers, where you live, the geographic communities, because those monies are a means to kingdom success ends, not Wall Street.
Well, and that really goes back to the basics that as a Christian business owner, as a business owner who is a Jesus follower, the business should be a blessing to them. That profit, it should pay them, but it should be a blessing to the customers and the vendors and the community that they operate in, and of course, the employees and their families. Talk to me about how you help leaders think biblically about reinvestment, because that's that community piece. It's a community piece, and it's also helping the business grow. Because you got companies like Hobby Lobby who take 50% of their profits and they give them away. Now, Hobby Lobby's a little bigger than most companies that you're dealing with, $8 or $9 billion now, but they take 50% of the profits and invest them in community, and 50% of the profits and invest them back into the growth of the organization. So how do you get leaders to think biblically?
Yeah, that's a great example there. Is that regeneration is, well, one of them you talked about is generosity. So there's generosity where money goes outside of the organization into the community to support a nonprofit, a ministry, a parachurch ministry, what have you, which is fantastic. I love what you said, because it's wrapped up in another topic we might discuss, which is called the nonprofit dilemma. But why not 100% of your revenue go to making the world a better place through the products that the company produces, the services that the company offers? How it treats its employees, training, education, and developing the full potential of its employees. Again, the products and services that the company makes to in turn allow customers to prosper, allow suppliers to gain more knowledge about their industry. So when we talk about profitability, we talk about using revenue in a regenerative fashion. It is about the multiplication of Good Place organizations, with those two aims in mind, of building up good places in the community and allowing people and encouraging them to reach their full potential, both vocationally and professionally and outside of the professional realm.
I'm going to go back to something you just said, Chris, because it was very interesting. Because a lot of times
Mm.
companies think, well, all I do is produce coffee cups, or all I do is produce sheet metal, or all I do is produce plastic buttons that are used on the dashboard of a car. But when you just said what you said, making the world a better place, that's one of the biggest kingdom principles. That's that whole cultivate the earth thing from Genesis that we're talking about. How do we help business leaders who have a product or a service recognize that what they're doing is actually kingdom work because they're making the world a better place? How do you help leaders to see that? Because a lot of times they think, well, all I do is produce cardboard boxes for people who are moving. That's all I do.
In the products and services you make, in the skill sets you build up, in the industry you're in the business that you run, you have an opportunity to build up God's kingdom. So it is a mindset shift, that is a holistic, integrated kingdom mindset where we're not just sprinkling some evangelism on top of a worldly business model. What we try to get CEOs to do is transform their mind to redefining success from a biblical or a kingdom economy perspective. How does that happen? And so when we talk about building up hearts of love or lives of shalom in our internal members of the organization, as well as all the external stakeholders that we have an opportunity to touch, it's a mindset shift. And money, that currency, again, is not a bad thing. It's not the money that's the root of all evil. It's the love of it. It's the place it has in our hearts and our minds, which again, for most businesses, it's the number one thing that we measure because why? It's easy to measure, and it's what Wall Street and the world defines as success. So the mindset shift is redefining success from a biblical perspective and then putting money in its proper place in order to achieve those biblical aims and continue to multiply and regenerate and continue to grow in optimally improving the organization so that more and more people can flourish, more and more customers can prosper, the community gets impacted more and more, and we need the currency of finances in order to do that.
And that's why you should get involved with the Good Place Institute. We can help you change the way you think in a Romans 12:2 fashion about financial management, about your customers, about your vendors, about your employees, because God looks at those things differently than Wall Street looks at them. Chris, what does wise stewardship look like in budgets, pricing, or even salaries? I mean, talk to me. Is there really a difference for how a kingdom company looks at these things than the world?
Yeah, there definitely is, Jim, and there's more than that. I have a list here of things that we like to kind of go through that goes beyond accounting, because one of the components of financial management in a good place is actually it all doesn't sit with the finance department. We're trying to teach every business leader that their decisions that they make, they have financial stewardship ramifications. So number one is teaching people in the organization good stewardship principles. And then, like you said, compensation, profit, costs, expenses, CapEx, cash flow, liquidity, liability to asset ratios, all the, risk tolerance, the idea that you don't want to put your company in financial jeopardy by taking on too much risk or debt. What's the biblical view of debt? So we want to look into God's word and see what God has to say about our use and or our motivation for money.
Paul talks in Philippians about learning to be content. Philippians 4:11 through 13, that he had to learn to be content. As part of teaching wise stewardship within the Good Place Institute, online at goodplaceinstitute.com, how deep do you get into learning contentment? Because contentment, I hear these stories of CEOs that have $100 million salary. I'm like, there isn't anybody on the planet worth $100 million. I suppose maybe there is, but the learning to be content. I mean, how much money can you spend? I mean, those are people that have $100 million yacht sitting down that they use once a year. Who needs a yacht for $100 million? I mean, at what point in time, or how do, within the Good Place Institute, as you're creating good places to work, where does contentment fit into that?
Well, A lot of that contentment, at least the example that you shared, and I'll maybe tell a story here in a second about, one of our clients, that it comes into the point of compensation, and again, there's nothing wrong with making money. Wealthy
Correct.
people start businesses, so there's nothing wrong with that. But again, it all comes back to your heart, your motivation, if you want to call it your why. But for instance, the idea that, our compensation philosophy, in your specific example, it needs to be based on the Bible. A worker deserves his wages. Well, what do those wages look like? So this is where we tie in other elements of the Good Place operating system, not to get too much into the integratedness or the alignment of the operating system, but we want to train people to not just be entry level, but to grow to their full competency. And you can tie compensation, or you might even say the contentment of your total comp package, to not just performance, am I making enough widgets, or did I hit my sales goal, or what have you, but just your competency, your valuable contribution to the organization. And one story that I like to share is, we had a client who, there's a whole group of people that played a specific role. It happened to be field technicians. And we did our annual review, right, of marketplace compensation and the value to the organization and the other elements that go into a total comp package for individuals and their roles. This client found that role, market factors had changed. And in that role, the actual entry level compensation for that role, that company was actually below entry level. So before they looked at raises or compensation increases for the rest of the organization, they needed to get that particular group of people at least into the entry level and beyond of the marketplace for that particular compensation. And they did. And, that cost a lot of money, because it was, 30 plus people getting that group of people into the compensation range. But that's a compensation philosophy based on the Bible, and being content with the profitability by being good stewards of our money.
I love that example. It's fantastic, because people are your most valuable asset, yet sometimes they're treated like numbers. But when you recognize that people are undervalued and underpaid, and you raise them up, all of a sudden you've got loyalty like it's coming out the ears. It's unbelievable. Is it possible to make our financial systems, as we focus on financial management, to make our systems reflect our kingdom values, like trust, justice, and transparency? Because there's creative accounting out there, that you can make your financial statements say whatever you want them to say. But I want to be able to trust my P&L. I want to be able to trust my balance sheet. I want to be able to trust my everything when I'm looking at it from my account. I want to be able to trust it. How do you get your financial systems to reflect kingdom values if you're a good place to work?
Yeah, well, first it starts with competencies and character, right? So the first is competency, that we use generally accepted accounting principles. Simple as that. So we got to start with accounting and good, clear financials that actually reflect the state of the organization. So this seems obvious, right? We want to be very honest with what the information tells us on a P&L, on a balance sheet, on a cash flow report, number one. But we want to move beyond accounting into that stewardship realm, where we need to get into God's word as a leadership team and as leaders and stewards of the financials and the financial department, and say, hey, what is our risk tolerance? What's the biblical view of debt? What is a good cash flow? How do we have covenantal relationships with our suppliers, where we are paying on time, maybe even if they're not paying us back on time, but we need covenantal relationships. That's where trust, you mentioned justice, but that, transparency, honesty, integrity in the numbers, but also integrity in our policies. And actually, this is what we teach when we talk about board policy governance. There's an executive limitation called financial condition. And so part of it is we monitor these things every month, every quarter, every year. We have an outside firm audit our finances to make sure that the reports and the data is one of integrity. So there's stop gaps, there's policies, and there's philosophies, all based on biblical principles and values that come into play when you're stewarding finances.
I'm sure you've got a great example for us of a leader who made a tough but faithful financial decision as being a good place to work? What do you got for us today, Chris?
Yeah, well, the one I mentioned was, that was to the detriment of the bottom line, was bringing all of that group of people, 30 plus field techs, into a compensation range that made sense for their job, right? And then continuing to move them into full competency through training, education, and development. But with that comes increased compensation. The other example that I like to give is it's with benefits, because it always surrounds people, right? You don't want to ever mess with people's money, right? That's one thing you don't mess with. But also is individuals' benefits. So another example that I like to give is, we all know that healthcare is increasing like nobody's business. Insurance is increasing like nobody's business. And one of our clients, they decided to bear the brunt of those cost increases. So you don't need to pass all of them on to your employees, but you want your employees to flourish physically, emotionally, psychologically, et cetera. So you continue to offer those benefits so your people can flourish, because that's one of the three main aims of all good place organizations. And yes, it took a little bit of a hit to the bottom line, but always in the long run, because money's a means, not an ends. And the ends is people and building up good places in the community. So we want to use money to accomplish those ends. And sometimes it does take a little bit of hit to the profit. But that's where strong leadership and courageous leadership comes into play.
It's a great conversation. All we've done is tickle the ivories on the conversation on financial management as a kingdom business leader. That's why we encourage you to check us out online at goodplaceinstitute.com. Have a conversation with Chris Young. Find out how your company can be transformed by changing the way you think. Chris Young, great conversation today.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be with you as always.
Thanks for joining us today on the Business is Good podcast with Chris Young from the Good Place Institute. If today's conversation encouraged, challenged, maybe just blew your mind, we'd love to hear about it. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to our podcast that we'll release every other week, and our YouTube channel as well, and share this episode with your friends, because I guarantee you this is outside of the box kind of thinking. For more resources on how to build a good place to work or to connect with our team, visit goodplaceinstitute.com.